Good morning, everyone. I, on behalf of Beyond Law CLC and UILS Punjab University Chandigarh, welcome you all to the webinar on as to how there has been evolution of the revision petition under Section 115 and ultimately under Article 227 of the Constitution of India. As we all know that Beyond Law CLC, germinated its seeds of thought as to how we should proceed further during the lockdown period. Instead of just watching movies and chatting on the different applications, we thought why not utilize the time for the purposes of enhancing our skills in the profession, not only as a lawyer, students and professionals. On this platform, we have been associated with large number of professionals, retired Supreme Court judges, High Court judges, professors who have been kind enough to grace this platform and help us to increase our knowledge, open new vistas of mindsets. Like tomorrow, we will be having Justice Madan Lokur and Justice S. Muralidhar of Punjab and Haryana High Court. And Justice Madan Lokur, as we all know, has just retired from Supreme Court of India. And during that course, we are having a different interactive session that we will be having questions and interactive session as to how we have to go ahead during these times in the judicial process. Be that as it may, today we amongst us have two speakers who are well-known lawyers, not only in Punjab and Haryana High Court, though their basic key practices in Punjab and Haryana High Court. Both of them are designated senior. Both of them have the established names, both because of their acumens, have also fortuitously were teaching in Punjab University as lecturers. Both of them are common in the sense that as a lawyer, as a teacher, as well as outside the platform, I have personal experience also, large number of lawyers in the corridors or otherwise, they have been kind enough to give the different aspects of law. We thought that once the matter like civil law came into being, who else we could have the persons who knows the nitty-gritty of law, and more so when we have been associated with UILS Punjab University Chandigarh, who has established itself within the legal fraternity that it's one of the nurseries where persons and children learn better and become good lawyers for future. Amongst us, we have Professor Ratan Singh, who is the director of UILS Chandigarh. I formally ask Professor Ratan Singh to kindly welcome these two legal stalwarts who have made their mark within the legal fraternity. Over to you, Professor Ratan Singh.
Thank you, Vikasji. Thank you very much. So, dear friends, as we know, that there is a hierarchy of judicial system. As starting from subordinate court to the district judge, from district judge to High Court, and then to the Supreme Court. So as far as these two provisions are concerned, Section 115 of CPC and 227 of the Constitution, there are many of the ways that the High Court is to interfere into the orders passed by the subordinate court. Reasons are many, and we all know that Honorable Supreme Court and Honorable High Court has developed a landmark jurisprudence touching the different aspects and different fields over the issues. And I'm very sure the Honorable speakers of the day, Mr. Shailendra Jain, Senior Advocate, and Mr. Puneet Jindal, the Senior Advocate of Supreme Court, and dear friends, I'm very sure that their deliberations will definitely touch upon the different aspects of the jurisprudence which has been developed by the High Court and the Supreme Court. I welcome you on behalf of University Institute of Legal Studies, Punjab University, as well as Beyond Law CLC. So thank you very much and welcome to all of you. And let's start with the lecture. Please. Thank you.
Mr. Jindal, you can take the lead.
Thank you very much, Professor Ratan, and thank you, Vikas. This platform Beyond Law CLC, it's a great privilege for me to be to share my experience and have a platform to speak my favorite subject, that is the Code of Civil Procedure. For most of us, for most of my colleagues, the CPC has been a very boring kind of subject. But if you permit me to say so, the code is the most beautifully drafted piece of legislation ever could have been drafted. You see, for providing a comprehensive legislation for procedural law with the kind of diversity we have in civil law, it is very difficult. But this more than a century old legislation had withstand various kinds of situations which the evolving civil law is still holding to be one of the best legislation which could deal with various situations and eventualities which I would say that we must kiss the hands of the drafter who could envisage, who could conceive, perceive various difficulties and situations and providing adequate remedy. Now, while I say providing adequate remedy, this is to be kept in mind that while at least some forum of appeal, at least one appellate forum or one remedy to a substantive, for enforcement of substantive legal right ought to have been provided, but at the same time, a balance has to be maintained that so many forums are not provided to a litigant, and the litigation may not come to an end because it is the human psyche that an unsatisfied person keeps on filing appeal after appeal from one forum to another. So it is also equally important that law should provide remedy, but remedies to a limited extent. And this thing has been duly taken care of while drafting the code. The code as a substantive right provides one remedy of appeal, as I've stated, to the litigant. Now there can be a situation where occasion arises for a party or a person who is not even a party to the suit but adversely affected. He has some certain rights, how he can proceed. Now we have to understand the difference in the Code of Civil Procedure context. There is a difference of the expression order and judgment. Lawyers who have been dealing with the writ jurisdiction, they have not been able to understand the distinction between a judgment and a order, simpliciter order. A decree passed by the court in the context of CPC is having entirely a different concept, entirely a different meaning than the expression order. In CPC, it has to be acknowledged that decree is, as the subsection 2 of section 2 defines, is the formal expression of an adjudication. Now, in another words, decree is something where the plaint filed by an aggrieved person comes to an end by a formal expression, whether it is allowed, partly allowed, or dismissed. So that is what broadly speaking is a decree. On the other hand, judgment is the reasons given by the judge. On the other hand, order as distinguished from the decree is order means an expression by the court which is not a decree. So in other words, order is an expression by the court which does not dispose of the list itself, the dispute itself. So it is something in the nature of an interlocutory order, something which the court passes during the course of hearing, during the pendency of proceedings to deal with various situations and eventualities that may arise. Now, as far as appeal is concerned, as a matter of right, as you all know, appeal lies against every decree. Section 96 of the CPC provides that first appeal will lie as a matter of right. So first appeal under the decree lies into the next higher court. If the court of first instance is a civil judge, then of course appeal will lie to the district judge. But if under the, say, Commercial Courts Act or other special legislation, the court of first instance is the court of district and session judge or additional district judges, then the appeal would lie to the High Court. Now this is with regard to a decree. But if there is an order, or in other words, the final dispensation qua that suit has not happened, then what is the remedy provided? Now, Section 104 of the CPC, read with Order 43 Rule 1, provides for certain kinds of orders against which an appeal lies. So accordingly, the legislature has maintained that any order which substantively deals with some substantive right, then appeal has been provided. For example, the most popular form of is ad interim injunction. During the pendency of a suit, if a party applies for ad interim injunction, or in other words, he applies for a stay during the pendency of the suit, then the order passed by the court of first instance is appealable before the appellate court as provided under Order 43, Rule 1. Similarly, many instances are there where appeal has been provided as a matter of right. But again, such appellate jurisdiction is limited only to having provided one appeal against such an order. There is no provision for second appeal against such interlocutory order. The orders passed by the appellate court are final as far as the law is concerned. Now, the legislature has provided a remedy which is in between providing a remedy of appeal and providing no remedy. That in between remedy, we call it a revisional jurisdiction or revisions. Next slide. Now, the definition as is appearing on your screen of Section 115, which provides for the remedy of revision, this definition, this section is as it existing prior to 1976, where the legislature has provided that those orders against which there is no remedy of appeal provided, those provisions against which no remedy of appeal is provided, instead of not providing any other remedy, a limited remedy has been provided. The revisional court can exercise what we call revisional, the revisional court will exercise jurisdiction only if there is an error of jurisdiction by the subordinate court. Now, the only 3 clauses have been provided. The revisional court can interfere only if the subordinate court has exercised jurisdiction which is not vested in it by law, or the subordinate court ought to have exercised so jurisdiction. In other words, the court below has failed to exercise jurisdiction so vested. The clause C provides, which is a slightly, I would say, having a larger context than clause A and B. It says that if such jurisdiction has been exercised with material illegality or irregularity. So these two expressions have been enlarged and widely interpreted by the courts, that any exercise of a jurisdiction which the subordinate court ought to have in a manner, ought to have as expressed in law, implied or expressly. If the court fails to do so, then it will also amount to error of jurisdiction. So only interference could have been exercised by the revisional court if there is an error of jurisdiction, broadly speaking. Now, this section 115 was amended 3 times. As you would see on your screens, the first broad amendment which came about was in 1976, in which, apart from the original section 115, which was renumbered as subsection 1 of section 115, provisos were added having 2 clauses, and subsection 2 was added in 1976. The object and purpose of 1976 amendment was to further curtail the power and ambit of revisional jurisdiction, to provide, to say that the revisional court can interfere only in a situation where the party applying for revision, if the court below would have finally disposed of the suit or other proceedings, had this the order which has been passed, which is subject matter of revision, has if it would have been finally disposed of the suit or other proceedings, then it is the remedy which has been provided. So in other words, as you would say, that if by virtue of proceedings having come to an end, a party is aggrieved by an order, so a remedy has been provided in such a situation. Secondly, they say that if the first situation is not there, then second situation is that the order has occasioned a failure of justice or has caused irreparable injury to the party against whom it made. So broadly speaking, keeping in view the substantial justice, the alternative remedy in clause B of the proviso has been provided. The said provision has been again amended in 2002 with the object to further curtail the revisional jurisdiction and the narrow window, that is occasion the cause of justice or irreparable injury, that clause B contained in second proviso was deleted and subsection 3 was added, as the legislature in their wisdom thought that because of the filing of large number of revision petitions in the High Court and proceedings have been being stayed, or because the records were before the High Court, the trial keep on lingering for months and years together. So subsection 3 was provided, wherein it was specifically said that dependency of revision or revision shall not operate as a stay of suit or other proceedings, except where it has been so expressly stated by the High Court. So these were the measures taken by the legislature to provide for the expeditious disposal of revision, and the work of trial court may not suffer. Another important development within the section 115 would be the interpretation of the expression case decided, as has been used in the subsection 1. Now this, the expression case decided has been interpreted by the Honorable Supreme Court in way back in 1964, that case decided include part of the case. So if if some particular issue or some subject, the court makes a decision thereupon, then even that decision will also amount to the case having been decided by the subordinate court, so as to entitle the revisional court to interfere. This was actually made part of the section 115 in 1976 and carried further in 2002. So this has a little clarified the situation that at interlocutory stage, that even as an order passed upon an interlocutory application or during the pendency of the suit, some situation arises, any such part of the decision or order which has been passed by the trial court or the court of first instance, that can be interfered by the revisional court. Now the issue which further requires deliberation is that what is the meaning of this expression jurisdiction used in all the three clauses A, B, and C of section 115. Now, jurisdiction in common parlance means three kinds of jurisdiction. For example, it's a pecuniary jurisdiction or territorial jurisdiction, or thirdly, it can be the jurisdiction of the subject matter. The question is that this expression jurisdiction is to be read and interpreted in the limited meaning of only these three expressions. Of course, the answer is no. Now, jurisdiction as used in section 115, though not defined, has got a wider connotation and will include the power of the court to adjudicate within the four corners of law. So, in other words, whether the court was entitled to, firstly, the court of first instance or the court subordinate was entitled to enter upon the inquiry in question, that would be the first, and whether the court has undertaken that inquiry within the four corners of law. So if these two ingredients are fulfilled, then the jurisdiction has been exercised and has been exercised without there being any irregularity or illegality. This revisional court, however, cannot reappreciate or re-examine the evidence, the pleadings which have been led vis-a-vis the pleadings. Under the guise of revisional jurisdiction, the revisional court cannot act as an appellate court. The Supreme Court had repeatedly cautioned against exercise of revisional jurisdiction in a form that it amounts to the appellate jurisdiction. The latest decision in this regard, though in rent proceedings, the Honorable Supreme Court in a 5 judges bench of Honorable Supreme Court in Hindustan Petroleum Corporation versus Dilbahar Singh 2014 has held that in the rent legislations, the revisional jurisdiction, since a special act has provided for revisional jurisdiction, which is in wider terms than even section 115, but still the revisional court cannot exercise powers which to re-examine the evidence on record, which alone an appellate court can exercise. So it has to be remembered that in context of section 115, a much narrower window, a much narrower scope has been left for the revisional court to interfere while exercise of jurisdiction. Now the question arises that the legislature has been very careful in providing the forum of appeal to a situation where it is very much necessary. I'll give an example. If a judgment and a decree has been passed where the defendant was either served or he fails to appear before the court below, an ex parte decree has been passed. Now, a person who is aggrieved by an ex parte decree, he moves an application for setting aside that ex parte decree. The interesting thing is that if the application is allowed, then under Order 43, no appeal can lie. If the application is declined, then the remedy of revision is available. So these care has been taken. Why so? An application filed under Order 9 Rule 13 for setting aside ex parte affects the material rights of a party. And if the trial court comes to the conclusion that he could not be served or there was sufficient cause which prevented him from appearance, then the remedy of appeal has not been provided. A discretion has been left open to the trial court. So therefore, no appeal can be filed against such an order. But again, a limited window, as I've said, a revisional jurisdiction can be exercised. So these are the many examples where legislatures has taken care that wherever possible, a remedy of appeal has to be provided, it has been provided. And where it is felt that there is no necessity, then no appeal has been provided. And the only limited is revisional jurisdiction. One more important provision which we must remember as far as CPC is concerned is Order 43 Rule 1 capital A, which provides that any order which during the course of proceedings have been decided, passed by the court below, then the party has not challenged it, but at the fag and a decree has come into existence, then while filing an appeal, the aggrieved party may also challenge that order, which was passed during the interregnum stage, during the pendency of the proceedings, along with his appeal, memorandum of appeal, challenge that order also. So liberty has been provided by the legislature. The object is that during the pendency of suit, interference at that level could be minimized. So this is the salutary object, this is the salutary purpose for which the law has been so framed. So these are, with this, I'll request Mr. Jain to take over with regard to the provision of Article 227, because as I have said that by coming into force of the amendment with effect from 2002, the clause B contained in proviso has been deleted, which I have highlighted in the middle column. Now the effect of this deletion was that the revisional jurisdiction was constricted to a very greater extent, and there would be hardly circumstances where the revisional court could have exercised jurisdiction. In those circumstances, the matter went up to the Honorable Supreme Court and the Allahabad High Court. From Allahabad, the famous decision reported as Surya Dev Rai versus Ramchandra, that is 2003, Volume 6, Supreme Court Cases, page 675, where the Honorable Supreme Court held that under Article 226 and 227, the High Court has been constitutionally vested with powers which cannot be tinkered away, and High Court exercising superintending power, supervisory function, can always direct the court below to rectify the mistake which has been committed. And therefore, even if the provisions of Section 115 has been amended to narrow down it further, the High Court can still interfere under Article 227 of the Constitution. With this, I request Mr. Jain to take over and further elaborate on the functions and powers under Article 227.
Thank you, Mr. Good afternoon, Mr. Jindal, and everybody on the platform. Mr. Jindal, thank you very much. You gave such an enlightening lecture on the powers of Article 115 CPC. I'll take the baton from you. Thank you, Vikas, and thank you, Mr. Ratan, Professor Ratan, that this initiative is being given to all of us so as to, energize our gray cells, which are in this lockdown are actually resting all the time. So I'll take the baton from Mr. Jindal. You see, there are three very important powers which the constitutional framers of our constitution gave to the high courts. One is Article 225, another is 226, and third is 227. This is besides 215. 215 provides the high court, it's a court of record, and it has a power to punish for its contempt. But 225 was one which was given to a high court so as to save the existing jurisdictions of the high court, which were then existing at the point of time when the constitution was framed. 226, we have already had a discussion, I heard, from Mr. Aman Lekhi. So you know what 226 is all about. I am today only deliberating on 227. Now, unlike Article 226, 227 had a constitutional historical perspective, in as much as in the Indian High Court Act 1861, there was a somewhat similar provision, which was vested in the 3 presidency courts, like the High Court of Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras, by virtue of Section 15 thereof, providing similar power to the High Courts. Indian High Court Act, may I say that, this was a charter for creating the High Courts. It was, you see, promulgated by the Crown of England at that time. And this would create High Courts subsequently also, besides creating the High Courts of the Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta. Now, this power subsequently continued in Section 107 of the Government of India Act 1915. However, for a short while, when the Government of India Act 1935 came, this power was taken away, but this was restored when the constitutional framers were designing the constitution, and this came by way of Article 227. Now we dwell upon this Article 227 of the Constitution of India. This Article 227 of the Constitution of India talks about the supervisory power vested in a High Court over all the courts and tribunals over which the High Court has superintendence throughout the territories in relation to which it exercises jurisdiction. Now, this was a very important power. This was a constitutional power, besides the statutory power which was already existing in the existing statutes, which was saved by virtue of Article 225. So this was a constitutional power which couldn't be amended, couldn't be trampled, couldn't be verified, and couldn't be done away with. And this couldn't be done away with even with the constitutional amendment taking place. So this was such an important power that it was to remain. However, for a short while, the 42nd Amendment of the Constitution took it away, but this provision was restored by the constitutional amendment of 44th Amendment of the Constitution. Now, when Mr. Jindal was talking about this power of revision, he was talking about that power in the context of a civil revision to a High Court under CPC. And it talked about the 3 error of jurisdictions. One was a non-exercise of jurisdiction, one was an assumption of jurisdiction, third was a material exercise. There was a material irregularity or illegality in the exercise thereof. Now, this was in the context of CPC. Insofar as this power under Article 227 of the Constitution of India is concerned, this is independently of the provisions of CPC. And this power was throughout available ever since the promulgation of the Constitution of India and is continuing till date. Now, may I just tell that this power there has been a debate sometime right in the beginning, even when this power was there with the Indian High Courts, 3 courts of presidency towns, as well as subsequently created High Courts, that whether it only comprises of the administrative exercise of power or it's a judicial exercise of power. It includes judicial exercise of power as well. So the preponderance of judicial opinion at that time by the High Court was that this is in relation to judicial superintendence also, and it is a judicial exercise of power over all the courts existing at that time. Now, may I just tell that what was the law which was at that time actually being adjudicated upon in the Indian courts? It was a bit of a mercantile law or some personal laws, maybe interstate or testamentary successions, maybe that a bit of a customary law, some revenue administration disputes, some rights of a landlord and tenant in agriculture holdings, and the area of adjudication was very less. So once the area of adjudication was very less, so you see this could have been easily tackled with the provisions which were provided in the at that time in the Indian High Courts Act, as well as in the Section 107 of the Government of India Act of 1950. But when this constitution came, the very purpose of keeping this jurisdiction over the courts and over the tribunals was to keep all the courts and tribunals within the bounds of their authority. Why so? Because after coming into the constitution, we had designed our state to be a welfare state. There were a charter of legislations which the different legislatures, the parliament was to come about, and under the various list or under the various provisions of the constitution. So the powers of the civil court or the tribunals to be created subsequently was going to be in large number. These tribunals were to be created one after another. So while giving the state a color of a welfare state, and as well as to give more rights to the people. And as you know that a lot of legislations after the Constitution of India was framed came to be about. We have the Patent Acts, Copyrights Acts, then we had trademarks, then numerous taxing legislations, unlike a police state which we had prior to the Constitution. Then we are seeing in the recent past, the RERA, the Consumer Act, and the other IBC code, and the various other where the courts would be established. We had the system of agrarian reforms put into our country, where the various legislations were brought in around so as to bring in agrarian reforms in the country. So all this, in all these acts and enactments, there was going to be a provision of giving rights and obligation to the parties involved therein. And of course, adjudicatory authorities, tribunals, which were to exercise quasi-judicial powers to be created for the purpose of adjudication of disputes arising in this new fora. So this required that there should be somebody who exercises the constitutional power of these authorities. So that is why the superintendents, judicial superintendents of Article 227 was given. Now the purpose of this was to keep all the courts or tribunals within the bounds of their authority, so that they obey the law, exercise it the way it has been asked in the statutes, empowering them, and dutifully it is done and taken to the logical end. So this was the purpose. And as you know, as a matter of fact, it was like, the court was to act to keep all the, let us assume that there's a galaxy of stars and every star is rotating around its trajectory. Similar are the authorities doing their jobs, they're imparting justice, exercising the sovereign functions, and though all are kept within the bounds of their authority. So if the trajectory of each other starts interacting with each other or infringing each other, then it was bound to create a chaos. The further purpose was to give this power was that since the people were to be manned with the judicial powers, quasi-judicial powers, like in Article 226, where the power was given to issue prerogative writs against the persons or authorities so as to rein them. Similarly, the power was given under Article 227 so as to rein the judicial, quasi-judicial authorities which were to be created under the various statutes which were to be brought in vogue. So this was to rein them. There was absolutely a chance that these authorities or the judicial authorities would become a new despot in the system. And as you know, whenever there's a power, there's a tendency to corrupt. The power has a tendency to corrupt the person. So they may start thinking themselves to be the new despots, to exercise the powers in the manner in which they would like, as per their whims and fancies. So in order to, as a matter of fact, you see, keep a control over them, this sovereign power of 227 was given to the high courts so that it maintains a rule of law. And that rule of law was basically only to keep the authorities within the bounds of their jurisdiction, and they may not trample this and go beyond that, cross the limits and remain that. So this power was independent of the power which was given in CPC. CPC was only adjudicating the private disputes, and so this article, section 115 was there, whether it was amended subsequently or it was unamended earlier. So, but this 227 was independent. There could be certain occasions where this disputes would arise, so as to keep the authorities within the bounds. We'll deliberate upon the instances of this subsequently. Now, what was this power was actually all about? this power, when we go into little fineness, this power was basically to correct the errors of jurisdiction. And errors of jurisdiction, what? You see, the jurisdiction, as Mr. Jindal defined, they could be pecuniary and on the subject matter and territorial. Now, we are basically, the jurisdiction can also be defined in a way that it comprises one of the source of power, or second, the manner in which this is exercised. Now, here, we are not concerned with the source of power. Source of power would be the constitution or the legislation. We are not concerned there with that in that sense. We are concerned with the manner in which this power is exercised. So the manner in which this power was to be exercised, this was to be within the confines of law. Now, every statute, while it will define the rights of the parties, I just talked about the various legislations, when we defined the rights of the parties, respective subjects, then it defined a procedure. It provided a constitution for it, and then the power was given, and there was a procedure prescribed. Normally, these are the authorities which are given the summary power of jurisdiction, and they were to exercise the summary power of the power in a summary manner, so as to adjudicate the disputes between them, between the subjects before them. Now, there is a manner of exercise of power in the sense that the CPC is avoided, Indian Evidence Act is avoided, and this summary jurisdiction, of course, brings in around the principles of CPC as well as the Indian Evidence Act in the sense, in a summary manner. So, in summary manner, these powers are to be exercised by these tribunals. Now, while exercising these powers, in the manner of exercise of these powers, the three errors could happen. One was excessive exercise of jurisdiction by them, which could happen by way of material irregularity or illegality. The examples of this can be multiplied. There could be another instance of refusal to exercise this jurisdiction. There could be a third one where it could be non-exercise where there's a jurisdiction yet refusal, and where there's an assumption of exercise of jurisdiction. I may give a few instances. Like this could happen both with the civil courts now or with the judicial tribunals. Now, may I just tell that prior to the amendment of CPC in 2002, the civil court exercises jurisdiction and it could be challenged under 115 CPC. Now, once that was taken away, of course, the purpose in Mallinath's committee, while this was recommended, to be taken away, was to restrict the power with the revisional court, so that it doesn't interfere in day out in the trial of the case. So every interlocutory order may not come to be passed, and the proceedings may get stayed. Now, this was the purpose, and that is why this amendment was brought around. But the moment this power was taken away, the people had found a new way to which they were not resorting to earlier. They started coming in the courts of in the courts of writ courts of 226 or as well as 227. Now, this challenges multiplied the litigation now, which was earlier there in 115 before the civil courts, and of course against the tribunals. This jurisdiction was always available even prior to this amendment of CPC, and people were coming at that time under 227 before the courts. Of course, people were at times invoking the 226 and 227. The area of ambiguity in that regard, I'll just point out later, still remains, that whether it should be appropriately 226 or 227 for challenging the orders of the tribunals. Now, this challenges were made after this amendment in the writ court or before the revisional court of 227. When these challenges were being made, there arose a confusion. There was a judgment in Suryadev Rai's case, which Mr. Jindal mentioned. It equated the two courts, 226 and 227, the two excise of jurisdictions interchangeably. It said that these orders of the civil courts or the tribunals, they could be challenged either in the 226 or 227. They both can be used interchangeably. And in that Suryadev's Rai, it was also held that revisional jurisdiction of the court under Article 227 is much wider than 226. This was so said. Now, this position of law continued till 2007, when subsequently a reference order was there by a division bench again to a larger bench, and this was resolved in 2015 in Radhesham's case. So this where the court was, the Honorable Supreme Court was pleased to say that against the orders of civil courts, we have no precedent that these orders could be challenged before the High Court under 227. So as a matter of fact, that jurisdiction was taken away. Now it is only the orders of the tribunals which could be challenged under 227. Sorry, this was said that they can't be challenged under 226. They could only be challenged under 227. So all the orders of the civil courts are now being challenged under 227, as well as the orders of the tribunals. But the orders of the tribunals are being challenged under 226 as well. So this area, this gray area still remains, that whether to go for challenging the orders of tribunals under 226 or 227. Now, may I just tell which are the courts which were visualized under 226, under 227? The courts were civil courts, criminal courts, revenue courts, and tribunals were, as there's no definition in the Constitution. So it could be all kind of tribunals which are exercising the quasi-judicial functions. And even it could be the administrative authorities which were exercising the quasi-judicial functions. So as Mr. Vikas deals in a lot of service cases, even the orders of the administrative tribunals, where the errors of jurisdiction arise, they could be challenged before the 227 High Court, and 227 before the High Court. Even a lot of orders arising from the other fora can also be challenged in 227. Of course, there are limitations to that. Now we will just multiply just give few instances about what are the errors of jurisdiction which can arise before the which could be challenged before the High Court under 227. Now, assumption of jurisdiction. Suppose in a dispute which is before a rent court is about the eviction of a tenant, and yet the rent court starts deciding a dispute of title between the co-sharers or the co-owners. Now, this is an assumption of a jurisdiction which is not vested in it. The examples in this manner can be multiplied. In a land acquisition matter, suppose there's a dispute between the collector and the two litigating parties about only that, and there's already a civil suit pending, and yet the dispute is to whom the compensation is payable. Yet the court, reference court assumes a jurisdiction and start deciding the original suit which is pending before another court. There could be various such instances, like even in a land acquisition matter again, the acquisition of a land where the validity of this could only be challenged in 226 before the High Court. Yet the reference court start deciding on dispute of validity of acquisition, where it is not empowered to do, because it is only empowered to decide on enhancement of compensation or area disputes or entitlement or apportionment disputes. Yet it start doing this. So there could be an assumption of jurisdiction. The court has to see in what manner the jurisdiction has been given. It should not be assumed and exercised in those areas. Now there could be instances of, I'll just give a few instances where there could be refusal to exercise jurisdiction. Let's assume an area, like in a case like abatement of proceedings. Now the amended CPC talks about, even if the defendant dies, the proceedings will continue in the suit, and the court abates it. It said, I don't want to, I just terminate the proceedings because the defendants passed away, so I don't do it. So in this manner, the revisional court under 227 will interfere, say, no, you have to continue with the suit, because the provision now provides for the continuation of the suit even if the defendant dies. This was a provision which was prior to 77, where the proceedings could abate in such a situation. There could be similar other instances where the court can refuse to exercise a jurisdiction. Now, with regard to material irregularity or illegality in exercise of jurisdiction, I just give a few instances on this account also. Now, suppose there's an opinion to be formulated for eviction of an unauthorized person under PP Act or under any act, and that opinion is not formed, and the notice is given to the party who is being affected by it. So one has to the jurisdictional fact that one has to really formulate an opinion first and then to issue a notice. This is a material irregularity in exercise of jurisdiction. Similarly, the principles of natural justice and principles of judicial fairness, which even in a summary jurisdiction one has to follow, and yet the tribunal, the court, refuses to exercise the jurisdiction in that manner, I mean, principle of natural justice are not given to either of the parties, then the court would do it. Now, there could be a situation where there's a malice in law, there's a malice in fact. The malice in law is different from malice of fact. Malice in law is that all the principles which are applicable and duly, which ought to be followed, which are lying all scattered all over, they need to be followed and they're not being followed, and yet the decision is made, then this could be a material irregularity, illegality in exercise of jurisdiction. There could be various instances of dereliction of duty. The magistrate, just by giving notice without inviting evidence, without letting in any parties to really participate in the proceedings, it passes an order. So, or there could be a dereliction, he delays the proceeding endlessly without giving a decision thereupon. So these instances, they're so glaring, they're so patently available. Much of a reasoning is not required to be deliberated upon. One can look at the things and just find out that, see, this is an error. And the 2 to 7 part, whether it's a matter of arising from civil court or now from excising from judicial tribunals, this all the 2 to 7 lies before the High Court, and the High Court can really intervene in the matter. While the High Court intervenes in such matters, the High Court acts as a friend, philosopher, and a guide. Sometimes it pulls up the authority below when there's a malice ridden, malice of fact ridden, when there's when the doctrine of bias is available, and one finds that not only that there's a suspicion, there's a likelihood of a bias occurring, the High Court can always intervene. High Court at times can invite under 2 to 7 see the proceedings, see the defect in the order and set aside and send the matter back. High Court has the power to substitute sometimes its own opinion also on that. But one thing one must keep it in mind, that this can't be a cloak of appellate jurisdiction. And appellate jurisdiction, one has to reappreciate the facts and then to arrive at findings based on evidence. And there could be an error of on a question of law or fact, but that is on the merits of the case. But the revisional or the superintending power of the High Court 2 to 7 will not be exercised. This is the limitation, self-constrained limitation, which the High Court has put upon oneself. Of course, is not laid anywhere, but this is what has to be followed, because where the adequate remedies of redressal are there, where is the occasion for High Court under 2 to 7 to really interfere in such matters. And there could be, you see, even if there's a finality of the orders at times, and there are no remedies of revision, appeal or revision, yet High Court finding these faults, yet interfere therein. Now, interlocutory orders Mr. General talked about, there also the High Court can interfere. Of course, High Court, while exercising powers under 2 to 7 on interlocutory orders, would like to see whether it is going to procrastinate the education of the dispute, or it is, if High Court finds that the dispute can really be, the defect can really be cured at the appellate or revisional state, the High Court will decline to do it. Or sometimes the stitch in time saves 9. High Court sees that later on this can't be, this defect in the interlocutory order or the final order, the interlocutory order can't be ultimately cured. So High Court would immediately interfere. So High Court has to exercise this ex parte with due circumspection, due caution, and of course the experience of the experience of its and men matter things with the passage of time gained by it, and then look upon the order. Now, this confusion, as we talked about, remain in 2 to 6 and 2 to 7. The Suryadev Rai said even the civil court orders, interlocutory orders, could be challenged in 2 to 6 as well as 2 to 7, and they can be changed interchangeably. I mean, these jurisdictions can be there interchangeably exercised. No, this view was ultimately taken away, and it was said that for the civil court orders, it is only 2 to 7 and not 2 to 6. Now, High Court only exercises this jurisdiction with regard to the territories with respect to which it exercises jurisdiction. There's no provision like Article 226, sub-Article 2, where the cause of action has arisen in your territory, and the disputers and the seat of the tribunal is situated elsewhere. Now, this is what is a gray area which I am talking about. There are two things which need to be further clarified, because I'll just indicate that. Now, what happens is suppose IBC sits at somewhere in Delhi, or let's assume that DRAT sits at Delhi. Now the cause of action has arisen here. The seat is at Delhi. So could the High Court excise this 227? Because that's also a judicial tribunal. There's similar provision to Article 226, sub-Article 2 doesn't exist since in 227. So probably this jurisdiction can't be excised in 227. If the seat is situated somewhere outside and the cause of action is still there, partly or wholly existing in the territorial jurisdiction of the High Court, yet there's a doubt about it, but this part can be done. But this part can obviously be excised under 226 because there's a sub-Article 2 there. So now the question arises is some of the judicial tribunals have a seat in the territory in which the High Court exercises jurisdiction. Some have a seat outside. Now, if those tribunals which have a seat here, there the 227 can be excised. Where the seat is there outside, there's a doubt about that whether this can be done. Then the remedy is only 226, and that is why the people normally come in 226 for the same. Now, I'll just point out one more fine distinction. These two constitutional powers of 226 and 227 are just independent. They are not in addition to each other, as a matter of fact. Of course, 227 has its own connotations. 227 is accessible for fundamental rights for any purpose against personal authority. 227 is available for the courts as well as for the judicial tribunals. Now, these powers are independent. We normally label our petitions as 226 or 227. Now, may I tell you the subtle difference? What happens is, suppose you bring any cause for challenging an order, interlocutory or final order of a judicial tribunal in a writ under 226. Now you challenge that order. Now, if it goes before a single bench, then there's an intra-court appeal and one can go to the division bench. If a similar order is challenged, which is challengeable also, because error of jurisdiction can be challenged either in 226 as well as in 227. In 226, it's a certiorari. There's no label given in 227, but you can always challenge error of jurisdiction. Now you challenge in 227. You are another alternative remedy. So independent remedy, sorry, not alternative. So this remedy you avail of. You come in 227, you challenge before the High Court. There's no intra-court appeal because clause 10 bars the remedy of revision, intra-court appeal against a revision. So you can't challenge that. So you have a choice of a forum shopping. Now this area with regard to courts, since it has been clarified now by the Radhesham's court that 226 is not available against the interlocutory order of the court, or but 227 is available to the writ court as well as to the 227 this. So one has a choice to go and choose for that, except that one has to see that whether one wants to avail an intra-court appeal in case the matter goes to a single bench. If it is double bench, obviously one would not that way, because 227 is in our High Court at least lies to the single bench. Now there's some High Courts where the 227 goes to the double bench, like in Bombay and maybe some other High Courts. So there, of course, this intra-court appeal benefit would not happen because the matter is straightaway decided by the division bench. Now this part, once you equate for judicial tribunals that 226 and 227 can be changed interchangeably, then the High Court, by amending its rules, have to now give a shape so that it doesn't become a ground of forum shopping. And this is what actually can happen. A lot of people now can invoke 227 for the cases where they've been going on 226 because this is equally a remedy which is available independent of 226. So this was all about the 227. So the law has not changed. 227 was available all the times as it is. With 115 being amended, of course, that power has been taken away from the CPC, but 227 was always independent of the power of 115. So now, instead of going to 115, people are coming to 227. Of course, this power has to be exercised not just for the technical and correcting technical or just little errors just on the drop of hat. Of course, it has to be exercised very sparingly. It is a discretionary power. It's a power with the court where the court has to see manifest injustice happening to a party. It is outrageous for the court to look at it, and there's not much reasoning and deliberation required. The court sees that this is there, and you can point on it and get a relief. So this power is still available. We can exercise it for the tribunals. We can exercise it for the courts. And of course, there has always been a trend in our court that we label our petitions in 2 to 6, 2 to 7. But independently of that, one has a choice right now, and one can come in 2 to 7, like now we are coming for the judicial orders, civil court orders in 2 to 7. One can come even against the tribunals also for 2 to 7. And this practice has started growing in the High Court. So this is all about 2 to 7, a very important constitutional power which is given into the High Courts, where all the judicial tribunals of the courts are well kept within the bounds so that they obey the law, unless they become despots of their own kinds. This is just, and if I just give a Hindi word to it, normally this revision would used to be said as nigarani. You see, the High Court keeps an eye over all the tribunals, try to keep them within the bounds. So it's a nigarani, just keeping an eye on them. Wherever the error occurs, it pulls out its stick and tries to correct it. Whether it's a friendly hand or it's a headmaster's hand, it is for the High Court to decide. But this is a power which is still available, not being affected by the amendment of CPC. This is all in this regard to this. Now, I think I've taken a lot of time on this. So
thank you, Mr. Jain. It has been a wonderful session. The insights given by you would go larger in clearing the doubts of the minds, if any, which the lawyers or the students or the teaching faculty had. Mr. Puneet Jindal, after just wanted to chip in some further points.
After enlightening address of Mr. Jain, I only just want to add something that there was a thought during in the framing of Section 15 that once the powers under Article 227, now it eventually 226, qua the judicial authority is not available. Of course, qua quasi-judicial authorities, it is available. But for a court, judicial court, passing an order, 227 is available. That in the presence of that constitutional provision, whether there is any need of Section 115 at all. So that is the question. Now, as the idea why still it exists in the statute book is because to inform the High Court while exercising 227 that self-restraint be exercised by the High Court not to interfere in matters which go beyond the jurisdictional error. So the idea and the purpose of Section 115 post interpretation of the powers four corners of 227 is only to this extent, that as very rightly said, that it is only a nigrani in common language, we can say a nigrani by a headmaster. It's not to teach the class, go to the classroom and teach the students. Only the headmaster is to see whether the teacher is doing his duties or not. That's the only thing which I wanted to say, that in the face of 227, what is the object and purpose of Section 115? Thank you.
Mr. Jain, do you want, or should I start the Q&A?
It's all right, but at times, you know, the High Court, while finding that there's going to be a delay in the proceedings, at times can set aside and send it back also, and can at times substitute its own opinion also. The warrants on the situations, you know, High Court would look at it. Now, every day in, day out, we see that people are coming to say that one more opportunity of leading evidence may be given. And the High Court says, like, all right, just give one opportunity with such and such cost. Cost is taken as a panacea for all ills to be taken care of. So the High Court substitute says, all right, one opportunity. At times, the High Court do substitute its own opinion. And in that sense, Nigrani includes that substituting your own opinion as well as setting aside the order. You see this, this is what the High Court normally does. So the High Court is a guide, is a philosopher and a friend to the court. Sometimes it lays down the manner in which the power has to be exercised. And you see why the lot of revisions which come to the High Court is actually requires the proper training of our judicial officers, which normally they don't follow the law while they exercise their jurisdiction. And sometimes there's, of course, there's a divergence of opinion by the High Court, and they follow one view or another, and that is how. And they can follow either of the views. Sometimes they follow one view or another, sometimes they become independent. So they keep recklessly exercising the power. So a lot of chances arise. And same is the fashion with the occasion with the quasi-judicial functionaries, which are tribunals, because there's no training with them. They don't know what are the principles of natural justice, what are the fair procedures of law, fundamental procedures of law which need to be followed, and relevancy of evidence. Not that in the terms of what we understand in Indian Evidence Act. It's in terms of what are evidence is relevant. Sometimes the relevant evidence, they don't allow it to be there on the court. Sometimes they ignore that evidence. Sometimes they don't know how the notice is to be served. A lot of training is required. So we still, it is of course a lawyer's paradise that they keep getting the revisions to the High Court, and they avail this opportunity. And of course, with this, if there's any questions on the precise operation of this power. Of course, I wish to say lastly, that this has never been thought out to be a substitute of appellate jurisdiction. And wherever the remedies are there available in the law, that that constrains the High Court not to exercise its power under 227, because those remedies can be availed of if they're sufficient. Of course, High Court power is still there. High Court can, if finds, even with the exercise of those restrictions, even the manifest injustice can happen, it would do. But if there's a revision lying to the High Court, appeal lying to the High Court, High Court not still exercise a power against itself for this. So High Court would only see that if the remedies down below are there, suitably available. So High Court would not do. This power of 215 is to, again to keep whatever judgments to the Supreme Court and the High Court which are delivered, and the judicial officers down below and the authorities, judicial authorities, they keep following that law also. So this can be excised for the purposes of wherever there's a violation of the same. So this all is a scope, and you see this is all. There are various ways this power. No evidence. The disputes where there is no evidence, where the disputes where the scanty where there's evidence which has been irrelevant or inadmissible, that has been taken into consideration, or the findings are given on conjectures, analysis. There's so many areas. So this power is equally very wide. It's not unlimited. The four corners of this power has to be found in the Constitution itself, like the various provisions. They themselves, they have to operate, harmoniously. So the restraints of this power are in the Constitution. As such, there is no restraint with the 227. It's a wide enough power. Rather, the Suryadev case said one thing more. It's sometimes wider than even 226 to say that. It's a correctional jurisdiction. While you go in for a writ under 226, the writ court in certiorari can only quash a decision. But in 227, it can really take you forward to give you directions, what the way that the tribunal or the court should function. So that is like a friend guide, and I said the philosopher, the court can always guide. So this is a great power with the High Court. Keep all the authorities within the bounds, and it can also exercise administrative control over the courts. Of course, the word that is given in Article 2272, that it can exercise over such courts administrative control. Of course, in Article 2274, it cannot exercise its power over the armed forces tribunal. So judicial tribunals administrative control is probably not there with the High Court under 227. That's fine, Mr. Vikasji. That's fine. Yes, anything which further requires clarification on my side, I can give.
Thank you. Hello.
Yes.
Mr. Jindal. We are just taking on the Q&A. What has been gathered while we heard both of you, that when the regional jurisdiction is concerned, primarily the court goes for substantial justice, and sometimes, while as Mr. Jain was saying, that sometimes you allow one opportunity even though it was not required. They primarily rely upon the main principle that justice must not only be done, but it must be seen to be done, so that the party does not feel that he had certain thing and.
Hello. Hello.
Yeah.
Mr. Vikasji, you are not audible. Please, you have to improve your system.
Mr. Sai Amar Vivek, who is a lawyer out in Chandigarh, he poses a question that pending in a foreign court to be got conducted from an Indian national within the plaintiff in foreign court has now to approach the Indian High Court concerned with the letter of request of foreign courts for.
I'm not able to hear at all the question, as well as it's not audible at all. ये तो discontinuous और क्या चक्कर? अब ठीक हो गया? उधर से नहीं है।
वो यार So I was somehow I was also muted.
Okay.
I'm just coming to that.
Okay. Sound please.
So that I am at par with other people. Chat. I will unmute Amar Vivek. He can ask the question himself.
Good morning, sir. Thank you very much for a very, very enlightening session to us. My question is that a foreign court has issued a letter of request in the favor of one of the Indian high courts for discovery, production and inspection of documents available with an Indian national in India who's not party to the foreign civil proceedings. Now, with that letter of request, the plaintiff in foreign court has to approach the Indian high court. So what would be the more appropriate, whether Article 227 or 226, because he's not challenging any order?
You see, Mr. Jindal, I'll just attempt briefly and then you also answer later.
Please.
As a matter of fact, of course, the challenge in 227 is to the decision-making process. But as you know, the courts or the tribunals, they function through orders. And as a matter of fact, the orders are basically brought before the court for errors showing error of jurisdiction. So simple letter as this, I don't think that this would be a 227 would be a good forum to challenge this. Maybe a 226 would be a forum, provided, of course, as per the international law and all those things, the locus standi is fulfilled by the person concerned, and this matter can be brought to the 226 court. Yes, Mr. Jindal, you can now take over.
Yes, Mr. Vivek, that the record is in some civil proceeding pending in the Indian court, or it's with the individual? Unmute Mr. Amar Vivek.
I'm Amar Vivek.
Sir, it is a civil proceeding pending in a foreign court.
Proceedings and record from that pending civil proceedings is required.
Yes, for that civil proceeding is required from India, from an Indian national who's not party there.
He is not a party in that foreign court, but those pending proceedings, their proceedings are already pending in a subordinate court.
Yes, in a civil court. In a civil court.
In a civil court.
Yes. Actually, it is English High Court. It is English High Court where the proceedings are pending. It's a big amount commercial.
The letter of request for production of record is available in some civil proceedings, some other civil proceedings pending in India. Am I right?
No. There is no proceeding pending in India.
All right.
There is an Indian national from whom the record has to be obtained.
Then probably 227 will not be there, as rightly said by Mr. Jain. But I am apprehensive that even 226 might also not be available.
because letter of request from the English High Court is addressed to the High Court in India.
High Court in India.
Concerned High Court to the Honorable High Court of so and so. That it is akin to Section 78 of CPC.
Very right. All right.
And it is in Hague Convention
Right.
that such a letter of request can be issued, but provided the proceeding is civil.
Obviously.
My only limited question is whether we only challenge an order under 227 or we can even seek a direction like this.
No,
that there is a letter of request.
It would be, of course, an original jurisdiction.
Okay.
It would, of course, be original jurisdiction, and even 226, because he's not challenging any order.
Yes.
Neither he's asking for certiorari nor for. It's only in a sort of a mandamus he's asking.
That's true. That's true.
And that too against a private person. But it may not be either under Article 226 or under 227. It may be under any other plenary powers of the High Court.
Right. Thank you.
Rosie Chahar, the power of superintendence in administrative matter. The power of superintendence in and also in judicial powers. Then the matter can pass judicial order under 227. What they come under precedence on, whether it comes under precedence or not.
You see, as Mr. Jindal, I just attempt to this. As a matter of fact, if there's some order passed by the administrative authority and that authority has decided some right of the party, maybe delinquent or whatever, the person facing the inquiry or whatever. Now, if it is exercising quasi-judicial power and there are no further remedies, I may say that the remedies are about to, there's a self-constant limitation in 227 that they will not do it. Now, if there are remedies, then of course the remedies will be availed of. And even if those remedies are very inefficacious found by the High Court can also intervene. So if the remedies are there, then of course the remedies would be availed of. And if there's no remedy and there's a finality to this, then, and of course, one has to also see, as Mr. Jindal said, that there's a provision in Order 43 that this order could be challenged and appealed. Similar provision principles are also applicable. If there's already an appeal against a final order, in which the interim order can also be taken care of, then also the appellate remedy against the final order. Otherwise, you can't leave anybody remediless. So one can always come to the High Court under 227. 227 is a good remedy.
Kshitij, this is specifically towards the question pointed towards Mr. Jindal. Though Mr. Jain can also give his
after
input.
Mr. Jindal only.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Kshitij asks, at what stage does the objection related to jurisdiction/superintendence need to be taken? Mr. Jindal referred to orders being challenged at the end, but would not the delay in challenging amount to any waiver? What about the interplay between Section 21 of the CPC, Section 115 CPC, or Article 227?
Yes. Well, very right. The question of territorial jurisdiction as per Section 21 of the CPC is to be taken at the first instance itself, because the legislature thought that once that objection has not been raised at the preliminary stage and the party aggrieved allows the trial to commence, issues to be framed, evidence to be led, then he accepts the jurisdiction of that court, and territorial jurisdiction being a hyper-technical or a technical objection ought to have been raised at the very outset, at the very initial stage itself. And therefore, once the proceedings have come to an end or they have proceeded to a greater extent, then the party who has not objected or failed to do so at the initial stage would be precluded from objecting later on.
I'll just add to this that Mr. Jindal is right, where you have already allowed the things to waive or increased into the jurisdiction, and now you allowed the proceedings to go on, a final order being passed, or you want to raise it at the end of those proceedings. There's no point that the court would allow. You can't challenge it in 227 to say that this jurisdiction, now I wish to come on a jurisdictional issue of the territorially or this thing. Of course, when the jurisdictional issues goes to the root of the cause, where the root of the matter is there, and then of course, because here we are concerned with the manner of exercise of power, and then if you allow something to happen and then you wish to raise it subsequently, with regard to territorial jurisdiction, I'm totally with Mr. Jindal. You can't allow it to happen in 227.
Abhay Gupta, although the ambit of Article 227 is much wider than Section 115 of CPC, but what are the matters in which only Section 115 revision would lie?
Yes, can I attempt this, Mr.
Yeah.
Chairman? Yes. Now, as the example which I had given you at the instance, where an application for setting aside ex parte is to be filed under Order 9 Rule 13 CPC, and that application is allowed, then revision would lie under 115, because it will come within the ambit of amended provision, where had an order been passed by the court of first instance in favor of the person applying for the revision, then the proceeding would have come to an end. So if that application under 913 is disallowed by the trial court, the proceedings will come to an end. So this is one example. There can be so many other also.
In addition to this, when we talk about 115, we are talking about the CPC, the powers vested in the civil court. The civil court, that is the word expression uses subordinate court. And the jurisdiction vested is where from? It arises from CPC. And the provision existing is the remedy of revision in CPC 115. So I think 115 is the best remedy. Why should we want to go to 227? As already said by us, when there is a remedy available, 227 will not be invoked. It is only when the redressal can't happen by 115, then one will go on 227.
Saksham Malhotra, is Amendment 2002 prohibits intra-court appeal under Article 227?
Well, the intra-court appeal is governed by the Letters Patent Act, not by the CPC. Of course, CPC has provided that there should not be intra-court appeal qua the appellate jurisdiction being exercised by the High Court. For example, earlier there used to be the limited jurisdiction of the High Court for 5 lakhs, the court below 5 lakhs. Any dispute arising beyond that, the first appeal would have lied to the High Court. And then LPAs used to be filed against that, or even in land acquisition matters against RFA, LPA used to be filed. But after 2002 amendment, that provision has been done away with in the CPC, as per the amended provision of the CPC, intra-court appeal has been done away with. So in the present scenario, as far as exercise of Article 227 power is concerned, there is no provision for intra-court appeal once the judicial order is under challenge before 227.
Thank you. Mr. Jain, would you like to?
Yeah. As a matter of fact, the clause 10 permits the letter patent. There's another provision, the letters patent, where this pass kind of a RSA jurisdiction appeal lies against a RSA or a judgment. There's a bar, there's a provision. I'll just search it out for you. And there's a specific bar under the letters patent where you can't file against a revision. And this judicial superintendence of 227 is a revision. As I said, Nigarani. So there's a special bar under letters patent. That is why there was never a appeal, intra-court appeal under 115 also. That is why there's a bar. The same bar applies for 227 also. Now, may I just point you a thin difference? What has happened is that we have been using the practice of labeling our petitions as 226, 227. And then we go to the intra-court appeal. Now, you see this question arose as one of the Bombay High Court, the case arising from Bombay High Court, and this was decided, that was probably Umaji's case or something, where the Supreme Court said that even if you label your petitions as 226 or 227, virtually you are invoking, one has to see the tenor of the petition, and if it comes out to be 226, the order is passed in 226. So predominantly the order will be taken as 226. That is why the intra-court appeal would be filed under clause 10 of the letters patent. If it is a revision, then there's no intra-court appeal. So order was being taken, even if it was labeled as 226, 227, it was being taken as 226. And then the intra-court appeal was filed. But if the order, as a matter of fact, would come, because the jurisdictions are interchangeably used, So as a matter of fact, 227 has always been taken as a code, as a power, which has been just for giving the ancillary directions, in addition to 226. Whenever in a writ of certiorari, the order is quashed, and if some directions are given, they are taken under 227. They are the consequent directions, consequent declarations, orders. So they are not taken as the main, you see the subject matter of the list. So intra-court appeal was entertained only, treating the order to be 1226 and never as 227. And that is how the intra-court appeal was allowed to be maintained, even in those cases where we would go in 226 and 227. But otherwise, there's a bar in the latest patent law, and that was since saved under 225, Article 225, and that there's no amendment to the same till date. So our latest patent of law specifically bars intra-court appeal against a revision, and then this falls as 227 as well.
Mr. Ravinder Singh, his question is there, but I will also incorporate certain inputs in that. He says that the limitation under section 115 has certain of limitation of its own, and Article 227 of the Constitution is on a different pedestal. Please throw on light on this. Secondly, how to decide whether section 115 has to be invoked or Article 227?
Well, I may attempt, Mr. Jain.
Yes,
yes,
Mr. Jain.
Firstly, under Article 227, there is no limitation. Of course, laches and delay would always be a bar for a belated invocation of jurisdiction of the High Court. So it has to be as early as possible, as expediently as possible. So limitation as such will not apply to either Article 226 or Article 227 of the Constitution. For revisional jurisdiction, again, normally the limitation period prescribed is 90 days. So the revisional jurisdiction is to be exercised within the time frame. Now the question, the second part which has been put, repeat the second part.
Second part is, secondly, how to decide whether to invoke section 115 or 227.
Yes. Well, that if once a remedy is provided under 115, if the problem falls within the four corners of section 115, then revision petition under section 115 is to be filed. For example, in execution proceedings, if an execution application has been disposed of and the matter comes to an end, finally disposed of, although the executing court has not acted in accordance with law, then the remedy available is under 115. But if there are other circumstances by which, by amending Act of 2000, the amending after 1999 coming with effect from 1st of January 2002, the remedy is prohibited even under 115, then remedy under 227 is to be resorted to if the ground so exists.
Yeah, just I add just a bit little in this. When this was the unamended section 115 and 227 was there, of course, most of the time the remedies were invoked in 115 and in civil dispute. So what has happened is now at that time 115 was a remedy. Now with the passage of time, now since the jurisdiction has been limited so much, at that time, of course, there could be a difficulty which are the cases where the power of 227 could be invoked. I sometimes see that since it was just to correct the errors of jurisdiction, where somebody could find out the civil court couldn't resolve the issue by itself, and even 115 court couldn't do it. There could be certain situations where you require the aid of 227 only, and there the disputes could be resolved in 227. Now with the amendment of CPC, now any kind of dispute, which now with a quite limited definition of 115 is coming to the 227. There's now no choice basically. There's a very small area of disputes which are left to be decided, where the order finally adjudicates. If the party which is defendant will come to the court, it finally adjudicates. So then he can come to the 115 court. So now the remaining area is all with 227. So there's no problem as it is. So wherever there is a limited area of now amended section 115 available, then one should go on 115, and rest of all the cases, everybody is coming in 227.
Okay. I'm unmuting Sapan. Sapan. So Sapan Dheer is the lawyer at Punjab and Haryana High Court. Both of you know, but large number of participants do not know. Yes, Sapan.
A great friend.
Good afternoon, Mr. Jain and Mr. Jindal. And thank you, Vikas ji. In fact, my question is that in execution proceedings, where the execution has been filed and objections have been dismissed, or somebody had filed an appeal before the session judge also. Nowadays, our High Court is entertaining petitions under Section 227 despite the remedy available to those persons as SCO and all that here before the our court, but still the 227 is being invoked by person, and the High Court is also entertaining. As Mr. Jain just told that when the other remedy is available, then Section 227 cannot be invoked. But still the High Court is entertaining such petitions in an execution proceedings. May I have some light on this from Mr. Jain or Mr. Jindal?
Yeah, Mr. Jindal can attempt it and later I'll add it.
Oh, all right. I'll attempt to answer, Mr. Sapan. Mr. Sapan, now if the High Court has exercised jurisdiction under 227, despite there being an appeal having been provided, as you said that second appeal against order is available. In my mind, it should be pointed out to the court, but the court may always say that, all right, you treat this present revision petition as a second appeal against order or execution second appeal. For example, if there is a case decided under order 21 rule 58 or 97, 98, 99 of order 21, then even if the aggrieved party has filed a petition under article 227, the court has the power to treat the same as the suitable remedy, unmindful of the title. So that is one way of looking into it, because then the High Court can exercise larger jurisdiction of appellate court rather than the revisional court. As I've said, that a revision is a power between appeal and no remedy. It is in between these two. So why a High Court will choose a lesser jurisdiction if under the law they are entitled to interfere in the order with a larger jurisdiction? So there may be a situation if the larger jurisdiction is available, the form of the remedy availed will become insignificant. The High Court has suo motu, can convert it into an appeal if the appeal is available. Otherwise, as Mr. Jain has pointed out earlier, that 227 exercise of jurisdiction will always be guided by the statute, will always be guided by the limitations provided in the statute. I hope I have answered.
No, it's very fine. You see, as a matter of fact, like I'm reading order 121-103, and Mr. Jindal pointed out it's order 21 rule 54, Mr. Jindal. These are the areas where the orders are treated as decrees, yes, and the ESS lies. You see, once the ESA lies, of course, the jurisdiction is there with that, and the court should normally do it. And as Mr. Jindal said, if the court has a power to convert, and if the court has converted it, then it's good enough. If it is not converted it, as a matter of fact, and some of the judges may not even like to convert it, they like you to withdraw and go to the ESA court. So there, of course, the court may be pointed out with this defect of jurisdiction, and the court should remedy it out. There's ample law available on this. So the court should, in that situation, dismiss the petition in 227 and send it back to the court, that is ESA court, where the person should go. I think the two jurisdictions of ESA, you see, ESA and 227 would be two different jurisdictions, and the scope of those two jurisdictions are different. So the dispute should be appreciated as per the ESA court and as per the scope of the powers laid down therein. And 227, of course, it only corrects the error of jurisdiction. So the court, in case entertains this petition, court should be well made aware of all this. At times, the judges are not aware of very many things, because we are lawyers who assist them, and then we bring them to the notice. And of course, you know, this is our role more to play in that than the judges, exercising the power.
Thank you for the insights. So much so, when Mr. Jain and Mr. Jindal were giving the insights, Sapan's wife, who is also a lawyer, Savina, she also chipped in to have the insights of that.
Mr. Virajji, you made us to open in such a, jurisprudence once, and the civil procedure code, and this power supervisory jurisdiction. These are such subjects which I do not know whether they can really make the things very interesting for anybody. But at the same time, you're pointing it out to us that somebody has joined it like that. So we feel encouraged. We feel happy also. And our days
in fact, the platform is much happier that they are learning from. It's vice versa. The associates generally give the law, etc. This is a different type of platform where we are learning from the senior advocates. The water is flowing this time downstream, where we are learning from all of the seniors, retired judges, and all.
Mr. Vikas, we are learning from you people as well. It's not. Both
vice versa.
That goes without saying. Knowledge is always mutual. You cannot. You are always. The day you stop thinking that you are already well versed, then it's the end of the everything.
Yeah, it's
a mutual understanding. But be that as it may, it's always a pleasure learning from senior advocates. We always look upon they are the icons of the in the judicial setup system. Though the questions are boring, we will not be taking questions, and we are already running behind against the schedule. Only 2 questions, as Mr. Jain was the trigger point for all these webinars. He conducted the first webinar for us, which ultimately has led to so many webinars. And then to Mr. Jindal, only 2 to 2 minutes take from you. Let's assume a young lawyer comes with has a brief, or let's assume a client comes to him and he doesn't even know the basic provisions, how to go about it. Mr. Jain, what would be your take on that? How should he go about it? Let's assume he wants to file a revision. How to search, under what section he has to go, how to go about the sections, etc. And how to go about the law searching. Because he also has a handicap, he doesn't have the online search engines at his home, etc.
See, as a matter of fact, I always realize that you should always be in touch with a good few friends and a few areas with seniors also. You should develop a kind of a relationship with them. One. The second thing I told in the first lecture, I told you that one should make the habit. You're a lawyer. All the times you have to read. If you don't make your back turn forward, you will not learn law. I don't think that you can learn law. You should make a habit of sitting in the library, at least for revisions. You get a RCR. You can read 10 revisions a day. There's small orders by the judges. And in a 6 months time, I believe that 6 month time is not much for learning. In 6 months times, you would know what kind of pleas are raised by the petitioner, raised by the respondents, all kind of jurisdictional issues, the preliminary issues, or the maintainability issues that are being raised, and the controversies are decided in various acts and revision in 227 now by the courts. So why not to read law, take up the RCR civil or maybe criminal, and just read them. And that is how this is one way of making about. And keep your, since the platform is open to you, I have a habit of sitting in the library. I'm very disappointed with the bar. I lodge this protest here with the lawyers, so that so many of them, I got an opportunity now today to lodge this protest. Their books are not renewed. And for the 20 odd years, the volumes which are lying, editions which are lying in the library are 10 years old. What our committee does? You see, I believe that when you get a crore of a rupee from the chief minister, why don't you bring it to the library for 10? I've been going to the judges' library to find out where I find a lot of difficulty to look the Halsbury's laws of England or the Halsbury's law of India. And these are the basic things, If you look at the Halsbury's laws of England, there's an answer to every area there. And you please try to find out and make a habit of reading this. And I ensure that all of you will press now for this. Halsbury's laws of England, they define the law in such simpler terms that each of the areas you can find, the queries you have in your mind, you will find an answer to this. And of course, when there is something of a revision comes, of course, you have to make an attempt initially. You should always try to know where the law is scattered amongst the books. And then you try to know that this is law, they're lying and all. What we seniors do is, we know the few judgments here and there, as and when we keep taking down that when the law comes, where it comes, and what are the changes in law which keep happening, which are the new laws which are coming. So I normally say that don't read the articles. Now you put so many webinars on this thing. Each one of these juniors should watch it. I think they are very illuminating and very enlightening. We should take this benefit of continuing education. There's a wonderful platform with Archie you have created. And I'm very happy. In the Bar Council, when I was invited and I went there for a distribution of degrees to the lawyers, I said, you lawyers, why the Bar Council doesn't do it? Now the Bar Council is also doing, I'm happy about it. Now they should organize for the lawyers, the High Court also, some trials procedures being followed, so that the lawyers or the High Court, they don't get to know about it. Of course, they know how to interpret the provisions of law. The trial procedure should be made known to them. We have so many lawyers who have come from the district. Mr. Chima is the other one. His lecture should be there. And we as lawyers should also watch some of the very investigative serials happening these days on the, instead of watching movies, let's watch some English trials happening. There's some, all those should be seen. There's one which is practices. There's one which is going on a practice. There's another which I'm forgetting. This. So watch this. You get to turn to law, niceties of law in these serials.
Suits on Netflix.
That's law right. Suits on Netflix. So so a young lawyer should keep good friends amongst themselves and among seniors. And of course, good senior is one. I would say that he should help out the youngsters at every stage. He should always welcome for the help and should be readily available for help all the time. Why not? So this is what we can really do to do this. So this is what, as a matter of fact, I normally think. There could be certain more areas where Mr. Jindal can throw some light with his experience.
From Mr. Jindal, we are asking a different question because we are running short of time. I will ask Mr. Jindal, what do you feel that whether one should go independently straight away? What is the effect of a good chamber or a lawyer who is having a large number of briefs? Whether a brand which is good, what the lawyer should do as a young lawyer at the time of joining the bar? He should go with a brand name, whether he should join a law office or whether he should straight away go independent. What is your take on that?
Yes, my take on that is that in the initial years, brand name does not matter much. It is the input of the person himself which matters a lot. So he has not only to read files thoroughly, but he has to see the statute as well. My experience is that person who joins the profession, they do not refer to the bare provisions. They read files, but they do not refer to the bare provisions of the statute in which that particular subject relates to. So that is one area where they need to concentrate, that while reading a file, they must have the bare provisions with them and see that what the provision says, and then they can find out the grounds and reasons in support of their case from the bare statute itself, and then see the commentary thereof either in the books or from the software-driven search engines. So apart from reading file should be read, should see that how matters are argued before the court, and one must understand that what is the limit of pressing a particular point before the court. So these things will come, a person with the passage of time, they come to know about it. But to my mind, brand name doesn't matter. What matter is the exposure. Ultimately, the exposure of a person himself before the court, that matters much. That makes the most difference.
No, Mr. Jindal, I just wanted to know, let's assume somebody joins any office. Do you feel that it helps in shaping his career or not?
No, it does. It does make. Of course, whatever you learn from your senior. So if the senior is good, he will learn better. That is always there. But self-study, of course, is most important.
Vikashi, without a sort of an elderly or a guru person, you don't know things, the insight of the practical life. I treat the law as applied science. And this applied science, of course, a guru or a teacher or somebody who's higher in learning, he can only provide. You may keep grappling with your knowledge, whether books or otherwise. When you come in touch with a lawyer, there's one lecture would clear your concept so much that, you can't cover up with the reading of the books. See, that is why you should be more close to good seniors. And they should also keep holding, every weekend with the subordinates, the kind of interactive sessions, so that they're brought up to the good part of the knowledge of law. So I believe that, and I see your platform as one of the similar type of encouragement you're providing to the youngsters. These days I'm watching Chanakya. You see, there's a Samdan Dand Bhed and Dand Niti. You see this, one of the episodes I was watching, the Dand Niti. And I was finding that Mr. Vikas has converted this forum into a virtually a Takshila. You see, Nalanda was to be established later on in Chanakya by him. But you virtually converted it into Takshila, and that's a wonderful platform you're doing. These kind of similar exercises should be, done by the seniors and the officers.
Yeah.
And it's only with the imparting of knowledge that the things can manifestly and greatly improve in the subordinate. And this is how the things go. And the betterness passed on to the younger generations one after another. That's all.
Thank you to both of you. Before Kshitij Sharma formally proposes a vote of thanks, words fall short. The insights which you have given in the 1.5 hours, it will go a long way in the minds of the persons who are participants. As large number of participants already know that we also are live on the Facebook. They can watch us on the YouTube as well as on the Facebook. They can continue to have the insights. It's not that Mr. Jain and Mr. Jindal have come on this platform and we cannot watch them. As and when they want, just like Mr. Jain has been watching Chanakya, the same way this show can be watched anytime. Over to you, Mr. Kshitij. And those who want, for tomorrow's webinar, we have judicial reforms by Honorable Mr. Justice Madan Lokur, who has retired from Supreme Court of India. And then we also have Justice S. Muralidhar on judicial reforms way ahead. Those who want to give suggestions can send on the email or the WhatsApp number 98725 we have written on the chat box. Over to you, Kshitij.
Thank you so much, Vikas sir. First of all, my big thank you to Mr. Jindal as well as Mr. Jain. I think it was fantastic hearing both of you. Before I formally thank you, first of all, let me congratulate Mr. Chatrat again. I think him, Mr. Sapandhir, and the entire team of Beyond Law has been doing extremely well. It's a very tough and a very painstaking process to bring all of this together. Not on a weekly or a monthly basis, but mostly on a daily basis, where you have to reach out to speakers, where you have to deal with maybe cancellations, your schedules, making flyers, making creatives, putting it on Facebook, putting it on WhatsApp, everywhere, making notes. So I think it's a great job that she's doing. Next, Mr. Jindal, I'll specifically thank you. I think it was a very structural approach which you took. We had a great presentation by you. It aids young lawyers, in fact, like me also, to take notes. The way you gave a bird's eye view was very interesting, and also thank you so much for handling all the queries so promptly. Mr. Jain, you've always been a favorite. We've worked on a number of matters together. And thank you for your in-depth introduction of the subject. We all know that civil law has always been a law which has remained in gray. I mean, no matter you read it 10 times, 20 times, there would be a provision you would forget. There would be an interpretation which will keep evolving. So having a black and white approach to CPC is probably something which is neither possible nor desirable, because I think that is where lawyers will always keep on coming in handy with their ways of interpreting law. Both of you, in fact, have shown some remarkable experience with which is banked upon, rich knowledge which you've accumulated over decades. And, here we just had a speaker, Mr. Vivek Atre, a couple of days back. So when I heard both of them, it made me feel that when you actually read on a daily basis, and when you develop that rich pool of knowledge, speaking would automatically and naturally come to you. I mean, because if you're hollow, you would not sound or have nothing to talk about. But if you have rich knowledge, then you obviously would have something or the other to talk about. Lastly, I'll add that I think Beyond Law is more like a family now. It should not just be Beyond Law during lockdown, but it should be Beyond Law beyond lockdown. I mean, this is an effort which all of us are putting in. It doesn't require any special effort to go out of our homes into the heat or into the cold or in the rain. It doesn't require any halls to be booked. It doesn't require any formalities like lunches to be arranged. So this is a term which I used to read about when I was studying during my LLM, that is continuous professional development. I think it's very important for us as young young lawyers, or maybe not so young lawyers, or maybe senior lawyers, to keep on sharpening our knowledge with every day passing. And I think we should keep continuing this effort and formally reach out to Mr. Chatrat if he needs any of us in any way to help him with note taking or anything, if we want this platform to continue. Lastly, about the topic tomorrow, that is judicial reforms, I think it's a topic which is very interesting, but it should never be made a basis to believe that it is only the other side of the bench which needs evolution. I think we also need to evolve equally. I think it's something which is to do more with self-introspection, that what do we need to do as lawyers to make the system better, and then later on maybe address the issue of what the bench needs to do to make it better. Ultimately, it is just about understanding one another's expectations in a more congenial, in a more harmonious way. And I think once that is done, it's well begun for sure. But let's always keep in mind that there's always scope of improvement in everything what we do, but there's nothing like perfection. So with that, I'll conclude my vote of thanks. Once again, a big thank you to Mr. Jindal, a big thank you to Mr. Jain for sparing out time, reading up on the matter, and sharing their immense knowledge and experience with us.
Thank you, Kshitij. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kshitij. Thank you. Thank you, Vikas.
Thank you, Vikas. Thank you.
Thank you, Vikas ji.
Vikas sir, your mic. Vikas sir, your mic.
It's not heard us, no?
Yeah, you need to unmute it.
Probably he's feeling hungry, so he's gone for the lunch.
I'm here saying that, as Mr. Kshitij said, taking cue from that yes, you have to study, because as they say, empty vessels make more noise. So the more you study, the more depth you have. The more depth you have, then you are more sound on law also. And that is the cue what we have taken from Mr. Jain and Mr. Jindal. While moving the corridors, we bank upon them. Just like the river banks, we bank upon them to give the good insights. Thank you, everyone. Stay connected, and we continue. And we will continue even these sessions on the Friday. That will be Friday stories, just like the blockbusters which are released on Friday. We will continue with the sessions there at that also. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.